Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream History Value podcast, and today I'm joined by Professor Jodi Magness. And today we're discussing Jesus, Qumran Purification, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, welcome back to the show, Jodi.
Thanks for having me, Jacob.
Thank you for joining me. So, can you tell us a bit about Qumran purity rules for those that may not be familiar with it before we work our way up to discussing Jesus and the parallels there?
Absolutely. Yeah, completely necessary. So first of all, let me clarify about Qumran purity rules. I mean, basically, the people at Qumran were following the same purity rules that applied to all Jews, with a little bit of a modification. But what's important to understand is that these rules applied to all Jews. These are purity laws that are in the 5 books of Moses, the Torah or the Pentateuch. So what I'd like to do, first of all, is describe these laws, and then talk about, the observance of them before we even get to Qumran. The subject of this, what we're basically talking about here is ritual purity. Even though these laws are in the 5 books of Moses, they're pretty poorly understood, if they're understood at all, by most modern Westerners today, including Jews. So what does it concern? Well, most of these purity laws are in Leviticus and Numbers. And basically the idea is that when, originally they applied to Israelites and then later Jews, when an Israelite or a Jew entered the presence of the God of Israel, they had to be in a state of ritual purity. Now, the laws in these books describe what causes ritual impurity, and then we'll talk about how to purify yourself from it. So basically, the things that cause ritual impurity can be divided broadly into 2 categories. One, things that you come into contact with, that you touch. And the second is certain natural processes. And I'm going to explain each one. Now, I'll also say that when you look at the laws in the 5 books of Moses and the things that cause ritual impurity, they appear to be very random to us today. I mean, there doesn't seem to be any really underlying rationale for why certain things cause ritual impurity and other things do not. So, for example, there was in antiquity a debate about whether human excrement caused ritual impurity, and eventually the rabbis ruled that it does not. So it's not stipulated that excrement causes ritual impurity, which is a little bit counterintuitive. So many scholars have tried to sort of figure out what rationale underlies this set of things that cause ritual impurity. Why were these things designated? And many scholars, much greater than me, have tried to figure that out. And nobody has ever figured it out, at least not to any degree that everybody agrees is the right reason. So I'm just going to describe some of the things that cause ritual impurity without trying to explain why there are certain things that do and certain things that do not. So among the things that cause ritual impurity when you come into contact with them, they range from things like touching a lizard, touching mildew on the walls of a house, and then on up to the worst kind of ritual impurity, which is corpse impurity, touching a human corpse. And then there are other things, of course, those are just examples. Now, in the category of natural processes, so examples would be for men having a nocturnal emission, and for women, examples would be menstruation and childbirth. Now, the important thing to notice is that all of these things that cause ritual impurity are pretty much unavoidable if you are a living, breathing human being, meaning that at multiple times during your life, you will inevitably become ritually impure. And that means that in the biblical system of law, there was originally no sense of sin being attached to being ritually impure. Being ritually impure didn't mean that you were sinful. It didn't mean that you were evil. It didn't mean that you were a bad person. It just was like a mechanical category. You come into contact with something, you have one of these unavoidable natural processes, and you become ritually impure. Now, how do you then purify yourself once you become ritually impure? Because you will at various points. So how do you purify yourself? So what the laws in the 5 books of Moses basically stipulate is that you are to immerse yourself in what is called living water in Hebrew, and then wait till, for most kinds of ritual impurity at least, and then wait till the passage of a certain amount of time, usually till sundown, and then you're ritually pure again. By the time of Jesus, by the late Second Temple period, Jews had come to understand that term living water as meaning any body of water that was a natural body of water where you didn't have an artificial means of filling the water into a pool or a container. So for example, you could use a river, think the Jordan River, a lake, a stream, a pool of water left after a rainfall. As long as there was enough water in the pool to completely immerse, you could be lying down, but you had to completely immerse so that the water came into contact with all the surfaces of your body. That was fine. Now, by the late Second Temple period, Jews also began to interpret the law in a way that it was okay then to dig an artificial pool to store water and to bring water by a channel from a natural source like a spring or a river or something like that to fill the pool, but you cannot mechanically fill the pool. So you can't take a hose, for example, you can't take buckets and empty them into the pool. So the water had to run naturally through a channel that you could dig from a natural source into the pool. And those kinds of artificial pools are what we call in Hebrew a mikveh, or a Jewish ritual bath. And one of the very interesting features of the archaeology of Qumran is that there is a large number of ritual baths relative to the small size of the site, the settlement. And not only is there a large number, there's at least 10 of them. Not only is there a large number of them, but they're also large in size. And the large number of Jewish ritual baths at Qumran and their large sizes reflect the concern of the community that lived there, and these were members of a Jewish sect, with the maintenance of a high level of ritual purity. Now, by this point, some of your listeners may be thinking to themselves, oy vey, what a pain to be a Jew. Every time I come into contact with one of these, random ritually impure things or have an unavoidable, natural process, I have to go and find, a pool of water and dunk myself in it and then wait for the passage of a certain amount of time. So what kind of way is that to live? But the fact of the matter is that most Jews in antiquity did not worry about being ritually pure on an everyday basis because it wasn't actually necessary for them. Because going back to what I said before, the need to be ritually pure really applied to when you entered the presence of the God of Israel. Now, of course, today, most Westerners who believe in God believe that God is around us all the time. He's omnipresent. So wouldn't that mean that you need to be in a state of ritual purity all the time? But that's not what ancient Jews thought. Ancient Jews, or at least most of them, believed that the presence of the God of Israel dwelled in his house. The house of the God of Israel was the Jerusalem temple. And so all Jews took for granted, and this includes, by the way, Jesus and Paul, took for granted that before you entered the presence of the God of Israel in his house, that is, before you entered the Jerusalem temple, you first had to ritually purify yourself. And in fact, Acts explicitly refers to Paul spending 7 days purifying himself before entering the temple. And that, by the way, refers to the process of ritual purification from corpse impurity, which, again, was the worst kind of ritual impurity and was a more complicated process that lasted over the course of 7 days. So most ancient Jews actually weren't concerned with maintaining ritual purity on an everyday basis. But there was one category of ancient Jew that did worry about being ritually pure pretty much all the time. And that would have been the priests who served in the Jerusalem temple, because they were the ones who served in the presence of God. They were the ones who consumed first fruits and other offerings that were brought to God and were offered in a state of ritual purity, and they had to be consumed in a state of ritual purity. And so for most Jews, unless you were either headed to the Jerusalem temple on a pilgrimage or producing some sort of produce that was destined for the Jerusalem temple, like your first fruits, you weren't worried about being ritually pure in most other occasions. But priests were worried about maintaining a high level of ritual purity for most of the time, pretty much all the time. And now, if we think about the Qumran sect in relation to this, so what we have at Qumran is a Jewish sect where every full member lived his everyday life as if he was a priest serving in the Jerusalem temple. And full members actually adopted the practices of priests, for example, wearing linen clothing all the time. And the reason is that this sect believed that God's presence dwelled in their midst. So if you think about the sect as being kind of a substitute temple, or really, I think more accurately, a desert tabernacle, something like that, this idea of God dwelling in your midst, conceptually, you are a priest, even if you didn't come from a priestly family. Once you were admitted as a full member, if you were admitted as a full member, you adopted a priestly lifestyle. So the corollary then of that, what happens then is that you would be required to observe a much higher level of ritual purity than most other Jews would on an everyday basis. And a further little corollary to that is that the Qumran sect also had their own interpretations of biblical law. And generally speaking, their interpretations were a little stricter than everybody else's. And so not only would full members be observing the laws that applied to priests, but they would have been observing them, generally speaking, more strictly, right? The laws would have been stricter than even the priests in Jerusalem would have been observing. And as I said before, the presence of this large number of ritual baths and large sizes at Qumran really is a physical reflection of the beliefs and practices of the members of the community that live there. Now, before I go on, I actually want to say something else about ritual purity. So when I talk about ritual purity today to my students or to groups, there's a tendency to sort of conflate it with or get it confused with hygiene, with cleanliness. And part of this actually stems from translations of the relevant biblical passages, where the word for pure is translated as clean, because there is an overlap if you translate those words. And what I want to emphasize is that the concept of ritual purity has nothing to do with cleanliness or hygiene in the modern sense of the word. In fact, it's almost to the contrary. And to give you an example of this, so if we take a look at the ritual baths, the mikvaot at Qumran, how were they filled? Qumran is located in the desert, and there's very little rainfall there, and there are no freshwater sources in the immediate area, no perennial springs or anything like that in the immediate vicinity. So where did they get the water from to fill those ritual baths at Qumran, the ones that everybody was immersing themselves in? That water came from flash floods, where we have this phenomenon along the shores of the Dead Sea of what, folks familiar with the American West might know these as a wash, where you have these dry riverbeds that 99.9% of the time are dry. They have no water in them. But on rare occasions in the winter, maybe once or twice in the winter, if you get enough rain falling in a short amount of time, you'll get these flash floods flowing with a lot of water, very strong flood, flowing through the riverbeds down to the Dead Sea, lasts a few hours, and then it stops. And so what the people of Qumran did was to dig a channel. It's an aqueduct, but I don't like to use the word aqueduct because it makes people think of like the Pont de Garde in France with the arches and all. It doesn't look like that. It's just a channel dug into the ground. So they dug a channel that brought water from that riverbed near Qumran, the one right behind the site. So it brought water from flash floods in the nearby riverbed. And that channel then filled all of the pools successively at Qumran, and you only needed one flash flood a year to fill all of the pools with water. And it's a good thing that you only needed one flash flood, because there were years when you might only have one flash flood. But one flash flood was enough to fill up all the pools. Now, what happens then is that once those pools were filled, they were used over the course of the rest of the year, not just for ritual immersion, ritual purification, but for other needs, for drinking, for bathing, for washing clothes, for all the purposes. And if you imagine then what happens over the course of the year, of course, that water becomes, filthier and filthier, but it doesn't become ritually impure. Because the principle in Judaism is that if you have a certain amount, the minimum amount needed for ritual purification, if you have the minimum amount of water for that purpose, nothing can make that water impure. A corpse can even fall into it, and it doesn't make the water impure. So no matter how dirty that water got, as long as the required minimum was in the pool, it was still fine for the purposes of ritual purification. And probably, if anything, repeated immersion in that water by all of these different people over the course of the year, if anything, that probably spread disease rather than prevented disease. And one of the things that I always like to say about the ancient world is that if we could be retrojected back 2,000 years in time, we first of all would be bowled over by the odorama, but we'd also all be dead within a week. And if you think about a place like Qumran, this is where they're getting their drinking water out of those pools. They're repeatedly immersing in them. So again, I'm emphasizing that this principle of ritual purity has nothing to do with cleanliness or hygiene in the modern sense of the word. So I'm going to stop there and let you ask me if you have any questions at this point.
Does this bathing ritual in which these people cleansed themselves in case they came across something that was impure, does that remind you of baptism?
Yeah, right. So exactly so. And I think that probably many of your listeners or viewers are thinking exactly the same thing. And that's correct. Because again, remember that John the Baptist, who's the one who becomes associated with baptism, what is he doing? I mean, he's immersing Jews in a body of natural water, the Jordan River, living water. And so remember that what the Qumran sect is doing, the people who lived at Qumran, what they're doing is, the same sort of practice that was, more widely done among the Jewish population. And what we see, I think, with John the Baptist is a slight variation on this principle of ritual purification, ritual immersion, in that what happens, at least, eventually, is that in Christianity, baptism becomes a one-time event for cleansing from sin, right? So in Judaism, it's a repeated act that originally had nothing to do with purification from sin, but John does something a little bit different. He puts a little bit different spin on it. And this is where Qumran actually becomes interesting, because if you look at the sectarian scrolls from Qumran, like, for example, the community rule, you see references to immersion in water or sprinkling with water, affecting not just ritual purification, but also the idea that you cannot become purified unless you also repent from your sins, unless you also atone from your sins. And so there's kind of an interesting similarity. It's not exact. It's not exactly the same thing, but there's a kind of an interesting similarity between what we read in the sectarian scrolls about ritual immersion, ritual purification, and what the gospel accounts seem to indicate John the Baptist is doing. And this then sort of leads into the conversation that you probably want to talk about Jesus, right? So I'll stop with that.
Yep. Can you tell us a bit about the parallels between the Qumran purification with Jesus.
Right. So it's not just purification, but it's more generally. So right. So actually, this semester I'm teaching a first year undergraduate seminar on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we just did this in my seminar with the students, which is sort of, let's line up and take a look at the similarities and differences between the Qumran sect and Jesus and his movement. Based on what we read in the gospel accounts. I told my students this: if you go online and you kind of Google around, you're going to find a lot of sites that claim that Jesus was in a scene, and that's absolutely not the case. But it is interesting to do this kind of a comparison. And before we actually lay out the different points, I will mention, Jesus was a Jew. John the Baptist was a Jew. So all of these folks, the members of the Qumran community, they're all Jews. They're all following biblical Jewish law. And so if you take any two Jewish groups or movements of this period and you compare them, you will inevitably find some similarities and some differences, right? And what's going to be important, of course, are the differences which distinguish them from each other. So let's think a minute about maybe some of the similarities between Jesus and his movement on the one hand and the Qumran sect on the other, right? So there are a number of interesting similarities. Both groups held communal meals, for example. Both groups pooled their possessions, for example. There's an imagery of light and dark that's used by both groups. The Qumran sect in their sectarian literature refer to themselves as the sons of light. Everybody else is the sons of darkness. So there's a kind of a similarity of imagery there. I think the biggest point of similarity between these two groups is their apocalyptic outlook. They were both Jewish apocalyptic groups that believed that the end of days was either at hand or already underway. I think actually in both cases, both groups believed that the end of days was already underway. So you get this end of days scenario. And so I think that a lot of the similarities between the two groups stems from their apocalyptic outlook. But on the other hand, there are also some really significant differences between the two groups. And among those differences, for example, is the anticipation at Qumran of two different messiahs, a royal messiah descended from David, that is a messiah of Israel, which was the usual Jewish expectation and still is. But they also added the expectation of a second priestly messiah descended from Aaron, which is not so surprising considering the priestly orientation of the sect. Whereas, obviously, Jesus's followers did not await the arrival of two different messiahs. They believed that Jesus combined both the priestly and the royal in his own person. The Qumran sect believed in complete predeterminism. Everything is preordained by God. And not only are all future events preordained by God, but your own personal makeup as a person, how many parts of you are good or light, and how many are evil or dark, that's all predetermined by God before you're born. So basically, there's no human free will. And as far as I know, that is not a doctrine that Jesus ever taught. So there are some really significant differences, but to my mind, there are two really big differences. So one difference has to do with their lifestyles. And that is that the Qumran sect adopted a priestly lifestyle. All full members lived like they were priests serving in God's presence, and therefore they observed the highest level of Jewish ritual purity. Full members, for example, could not eat and drink, that is, consume anything but the pure food and drink of the sect. Who they came into contact with was very limited. And so that's that lifestyle. But then if we look at Jesus and his movement, we see something that's really quite the opposite, that not only does Jesus not observe those, that degree of ritual purity, right? That kind of priestly level of ritual purity, but he actually goes out of his way to come into contact with the most impure members of Jewish society, whether it's a hemorrhaging woman or a leper or even a corpse. And these are the sorts of people who know Essene, no member of the Qumran sect would have gotten near. So we have a very big difference in terms of their lifestyles. But there's also, and this is connected with this, a difference in their outlook. And that is that the Qumran sect was exclusive, meaning that full membership was open only to a very small percentage of the overall population. In order to even apply for membership, and if you applied, if you were eligible to apply, you still had to undergo a 2 to 3 year long period of initiation until maybe at the end you were admitted as a full member, maybe not. But to even be eligible to apply, you had to fulfill the following criteria. You had to be an unblemished adult Jewish male. What does it mean, unblemished? It means that you couldn't have any physical or mental handicaps or disabilities. And the reason is because these are the same criteria that applied to pre-serving in the Jerusalem temple. Pre-serving in the Jerusalem temple had to be unblemished adult Jewish men. So those same criteria were applied to applicants to the Qumran sect, who then were tested over this long period of time before they maybe or maybe were not admitted into the sect at the end of that 2 to 3 years. And the reason behind all of this, the rationale behind all of this, is that if you were a priest serving in the presence of the God of Israel, well, you had to be whole and perfect. Every creature in the presence of God was supposed to be whole and perfect. The same criteria applied to sacrificial animals. They had to also be unblemished. And now if we take a look, so what this means then is that the vast majority of the population, even the Jewish population, couldn't become full members. Now, there were women and children in the Qumran sect, but just like in Judaism overall, they couldn't serve as priests in the Jerusalem temple. They could not enter directly the presence of God, right? So I want to make it clear that members of the Qumran sect were married, had families, just as priests serving in the temple were married and had families, but they could not become full members, right? They couldn't serve, so to speak, as priests, right? Just like in the rest of Judaism. But now if we take a look at Jesus's movement, we see exactly the opposite. Whereas the Qumran sect or the Essenes are exclusive, Jesus's movement is inclusive, right? Jesus reportedly welcomes everyone among his followers. So we have diametrically opposed points of view among these two groups. And so what I say is, make no mistake about it, there's no way that Jesus was an Essene. It's possible that there was some influence on his beliefs, practices, outlook, either directly or indirectly from this sect, right, from the Qumran sect. But he himself, in my opinion, would never have been able to, was never an Essene. Now, that then raises the question of John the Baptist. And we come back to John. And the question is whether John the Baptist might have been an Essene. So if there's any one figure in Jesus' circle who is most likely to possibly have been an Essene, a member of this sect, at some point during his life, it's John the Baptist. Because John the Baptist was reportedly from a priestly family. He was active in the same geographical area where Qumran is located, right? The area of the Jordan River there, which flows into the Dead Sea, at the same time that the site of Qumran existed. He, of course, has this, he places a lot of importance on immersion in water and what that process of purification can affect. And he lives an ascetic lifestyle, meaning he lives a very simple lifestyle where he denies himself physical pleasures. And so he wears very simple clothing, and he eats a very simple diet. And in that regard, in those respects, it sounds kind of similar to what we have at Qumran. So it's possible that John was a member of the Qumran sect, or at least had contact with them, but maybe even was a member at some point during his life. But in my opinion, even if we assume that John had some connection with the Qumran sect at some point during his life, I think that by the time we read about him and his activities in the pages of the gospel accounts, he's gone his own way. And I say this because we see some differences. So again, exactly what immersion in water is supposed to affect with regard to ritual versus, the cleansing from sin, there are some differences. They're subtle, but there are differences. And then we look at the lifestyle. I mean, what kind of clothing is John wearing? Well, he's wearing camel hair clothing, camel wool. So he's wearing a simple tunic made of camel wool. Why camel hair? Because camel hair is very coarse, scratchy. It's uncomfortable. So this shows, right, he's trying to live a very simple ascetic lifestyle, denying himself physical pleasures. Well, what did full members of the Essene sect wear? Full members wore all linen all the time. Why all linen all the time? Because they're imitating the priests in the temple, who also wore all linen. Now let's think about John's diet. What is he consuming? Well, he's consuming locusts and wild honey. These are unprocessed foods. They're wild foods. Locusts, by the way, certain species of locusts are kosher, are permitted according to biblical law. So that's the food that he's consuming reportedly, whereas full members of the Qumran sect consumed the pure food and drink of the sect. So it's possible. I personally, I think it's possible, but I also think that there's no way that we'll ever know for sure. We can just speculate that John was a member of the Qumran sect at some point or had some connection to them at some point. But as I said, I think that by the time we read about him and his activities in the pages of the gospel accounts, he's already gone his own way. But he is the one figure who we know about, at least, who could potentially be that point of sort of contact where we get some of those similarities between Jesus's movement and the Essenes.
We have a super chat question. James Valiant, thank you for your super chat. If Paul altered the Torah orthodoxy, as Galatians shows, and opened membership of the Jesus movement, how can we rely on the gospel to know what the historical Jesus fought?
Yeah, thank you for your question. And that is an excellent question. And actually, we can't, in a sense, no. There's no way to independently verify what Jesus thought or said, for that matter, because this is even sort of a corollary to your point, or in addition to your point, the earliest of the canonical gospels is thought to be Mark. And here, this is not my own scholarship. I'm not a New Testament or gospel specialist, but the sort of consensus is that Mark was composed somewhere around the year 70 AD, so shortly before or after the destruction of the Second Temple. And then you get the other gospel accounts that are composed after that. And so that means that the earliest of our gospels were written down, let's say, around 40 years after Jesus's death. And what you would then have to assume is that there were, followers of Jesus during his lifetime and afterwards who somehow preserved memories, if not written down, maybe orally, of his teachings, and that eventually those come to be written down and incorporated into the gospel accounts. But there's no way to verify, right? There's no way. And so we can't be sure. Now, I actually tend to take the gospel accounts about Jesus not necessarily literally, but let's say seriously and critically as a good source of information. And the reason I say this is because the picture of Jesus that is presented in the gospel accounts is really consistent with what we know about Jews and Judaism in this period. In other words, when Jesus is presented as debating the Pharisees on certain points of Jewish law, these are the kinds of debates that we know were happening among Jews. Now, does it mean that Jesus actually said that, or that these debates really happened? Again, there's no way to prove that. But in terms of the picture that it presents of Judaism in the first century, this is actually pretty consistent with that picture. And so I like to look at the gospel accounts, but please don't misunderstand me. I am not claiming here the historicity of the information in them.
Can you tell us a bit more about the theological parallels between Jesus and his followers and that of the Qumran sect?
So now I'm going to give you my own. I hope this is what you were getting at, but I want to sort of present my own thinking about one of these points, and that is the why was the Qumran sect exclusive versus Jesus and his movement, which were inclusive, right? Why do you find those different approaches? And I think that it has to do with their understanding of what was going to happen in this end of days scenario that I think they already thought was underway. And so basically, look, so in all of these end of days scenarios, all these apocalyptic, or eschatological scenarios, what you're working up towards is a period when the current world order is going to collapse. There's going to be a whole bunch of turmoil over a certain amount of time. The Qumran sect anticipated a 40-year-long war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. That this period of turmoil would either be ushered in by or accompanied by, or at some point you would have the appearance of a Messiah, or maybe in the case of the Qumran sect, 2 Messiahs, or maybe even it's been suggested 3 Messiahs, a prophetic Messiah, maybe also among the Qumran sect. So you'd have this sort of turmoil, you'd have the appearance of 1 or more messianic figures, and all of this would then end with the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. And God's kingdom on earth means the establishment of a kingdom where God himself is present. And because God himself is present, it means that everything in the presence of God is perfect, because there is no imperfection is allowed in the presence of God, as we talked about before. So it means that everybody in the presence of God is going to be whole and perfect. There's not going to be any starvation. There's not going to be any disease. All the animals will be perfect. Everything will be perfect. In other words, it will be a utopia. Now, what that means as a corollary is that if you are not whole and perfect, when God's kingdom is established on earth, you're not going to be allowed in. And if we go back now to the difference between the Qumran sect and Jesus and his movement, in the case of the Qumran sect, why are they so exclusive? Because what they're trying to do is to winnow out all of the people who can't get into God's kingdom on earth because they're ineligible, right? For whatever reason. We're talking about, people who have chronic diseases or illnesses or whatever, right? Disabilities. They're not going to be allowed in. And what the Qumran sect does, in essence, in their sort of admission criteria, is sort of put people to a series of tests to sort of ascertain whether they're eligible for admission, not just to the sect, but ultimately, again, to God's kingdom on earth. Now, and that's why they're so exclusive. Now, if we think about Jesus and his movement, Jesus is exactly the opposite. He's inclusive. He welcomes everyone into his community of followers. But here, what I think Jesus is trying to do is to try and make sure that as many people as possible will be eligible to enter God's kingdom on earth. And that, I think, is why we see Jesus going out and with a sense of real urgency, healing as many people as possible. And notice what he's doing is it's not ritual purification. It's healing from the kinds of diseases or disabilities that that would have made somebody ineligible to enter God's kingdom on earth. So this is not a case where you can just immerse yourself in water and you're fine. It's like things that are actually chronically wrong with you. He's going out, and not only is he going out with a sense of urgency to try and heal those unfortunates, he's even empowering his disciples to do that, and they're even doing it on the Sabbath, right? And that's one of the points where the Pharisees criticize him, right? Why are you doing stuff like this on the Sabbath? You're not supposed to be doing it. And I think it's this sense of urgency. Again, I really do think that the thinking here was that this end of days scenario is already underway, and he is rushing to try and impact in a positive way as many members of the population as he could. And so here, what I want to stress is that, in my opinion, Jesus did not disregard or de-emphasize the need for ritual purity. I think he took the need for ritual purity and the ritual purity laws as seriously as every other Jew in that period did. I don't think he minimized it. But ritual purification, again, except for corpse impurity, ritual purification is a fairly short and easy process, right? You don't put yourself in water and then wait till sundown. So if you do happen to become ritually impure, for Jesus, I don't think that was a big deal, right? So if he, a hemorrhaging woman touches him or something, so he can purify himself or whatever. So I think he took the laws of ritual purification for granted. What I think he was concerned with were the forms of impurity or the forms of disability that would have disqualified somebody from entering God's kingdom on earth altogether. And that, I think, is why we see the rush for these sort of, healings of all of these different unfortunate members of the population. And not just that, but also the emphasis on moral purity. So we've been talking about ritual impurity, but the laws in the 5 books of Moses also require moral purity, meaning moral and ethical behavior, right? There's a whole set of laws that prohibit all kinds of acts, all the way up to murder, right? And, those are the sorts of things, those kinds of moral transgressions are the sorts of things where you can't just easily purify yourself. It's not a matter of just then going and immersing yourself in water and then you're fine afterwards. Those are the sorts of acts that could permanently disqualify you, because those are the kinds of acts that tend to drive God away. And you don't want to drive God away. So I think that the reason why you see Jesus in the gospel accounts emphasizing moral and ethical behavior is not because he was disregarding the need for ritual purity, but because, again, he was concerned with making sure that people did not commit the kind of acts which would have disqualified them from entering God's kingdom on earth.
We have another super chat question. Vesper, thank you for your super chat. Is there factions of Essenes like Ossians and Nazarenes and/or the Samaritans closely associated with the Subians and Gorfana? And what of them?
Well, thank you for your question. I have to admit, I'd never heard of the Cebuans and the Gortheni, but so it's a kind of a complicated question to answer, as a matter of fact. And the reason why it's a little bit complicated to answer is, well, more than a little complicated, is because of the nature of our sources of information about the Essenes. So let me explain. So the short answer to your question is yes and no. So I'll try and explain why. So what are our sources of information? We basically have different types of information. We have the archaeological remains at Qumran with the Dead Sea Scrolls that are found in the caves around the site of Qumran. And those scrolls include types of literature that are sectarian, meaning that they reflect a particular beliefs and practices of members of a Jewish group that we can describe as a sect. And then we have outside historical sources from this period, meaning they are men who lived in this period who wrote about a Jewish group called the Essenes. And those outside sources are primarily Josephus, the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus of the 1st century AD, Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish philosopher who lived in the late 1st century BC and then 1st century AD, and Pliny the Elder, the same Roman Pliny who died when Mount Vesuvius erupted in the year 79 AD. And it's actually those outside sources, Josephus, Philo, and Pliny, who give us our information about the Essenes. They talk about this Jewish sect called the Essenes. They describe their beliefs and practices. Pliny even mentions that they lived on the shore of the Dead Sea, apparently in the same area where Qumran is located. And because of the similarities between their descriptions of the Essenes and the information that we read about in the Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran, many scholars, including myself, identify the people who lived at Qumran with the Essenes mentioned in Josephus, Philo, and Pliny. Now, not all scholars agree about that. And the reason is that nowhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls is the word Essene ever mentioned, at least not by that name. Now, so some scholars say, well, so Essenes aren't mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, so therefore the group that lived at Qumran, they weren't Essenes. They're not the same group mentioned in Josephus, Philo, and Pliny. They're another group of Jews, and they're unconnected, or they're not, right? They're not part of the Essenes. This argument that, because they're not mentioned, it's really not decisive. And there are a couple of good reasons why Essenes might not be mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls that different scholars have suggested. One possibility is the problem of language, because Josephus, Philo, and Pliny wrote in Greek and or Latin, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, the sectarian scrolls, are written overwhelmingly in Hebrew, and then to a lesser degree in Aramaic. And so it's possible that the Greek and Latin word for Essene, Esseni, Essenoi, was translated or rendered into Greek and into Hebrew and Aramaic by a Hebrew or Aramaic word that sounds a little different. For example, some scholars have suggested maybe the word Hasid, pious one, in Hebrew, was rendered Essene in Greek and Latin. Or maybe the word osei, the doers, those who do, meaning observe the law. Maybe that was rendered. So there have been suggestions like that. So first of all, it is possible that Essenes are mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but by a different term that we can't say for sure which term it is. And it's also possible, by the way, that Essenes simply are not mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls because this group did not refer to themselves as Essenes. It was outsiders who referred to them as Essenes. And this, by the way, is a very common phenomenon, right? Where a group will refer to themselves by one name, but outsiders refer to them by another name. So the fact that the word Essene does not occur in the Dead Sea Scrolls, at least in that form, is in no way decisive in proving that the group that lived at Qumran were not part of the Essenes. Now, to go on from your question. So if we look then, let's assume then that they're all Essenes, and let's assume that the group that lived at Qumran was part of a wider movement, which they were, where you had members living in other parts of the country. And we know that was the case. So if we look at their own literature from Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, we actually read about them having different camps. If we look at the sectarian scrolls, we can see that there are copies of the same works that occur in somewhat different forms with variations. Some of these changes may have been made over the course of time, but could it also reflect different groups within the larger movement? Very possible, right? And Josephus, when he writes about the Essenes, actually says that there is another order of Essenes who marry and have wives. He's talking about groups that are celibate versus not. That's a whole nother thing. At any rate, in other words, there are hints in our literature that there may have been different subgroups within the Essenes. And the other important thing to remember is that not only were they dispersed in different places around the country, but also this is a movement that existed over the course of a long period of time, probably at least a couple of centuries. And that certainly we would expect that there would have been some changes over the course of time, and not surprisingly, maybe also subgroups or variants within that. So there's no clear-cut question, no clear-cut answer to your question, but that's probably about as close as we can get.
Can you elaborate on the two messiahs? Why did the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls believe that there were going to be two different distinct messiahs?
Yeah. It's an interesting thing, actually. So let me just point out for especially for your listeners / viewers that that in this period and in Judaism in general, the concept of a Messiah had nothing to do with a god. The Messiah was not considered to be a god, was not expected to be a god. Instead, the Messiah was a human being. And for pretty much everyone, there was an anticipation that when the Messiah comes, that Messiah is going to be descended from King David. And we see that same expectation among Jesus's followers, that the Messiah would be descended from David. And this is sort of the idea of reviving the biblical, kingdom of David, right? Why did the Qumran sect add a second Messiah, a Messiah descended from Aaron? Well, if you consider the fact that this was a sect where every full member considered himself as if he's a priest serving in the presence of God, this is a sect that, at least in its original formation, was heavily influenced by dispossessed Zadokite priests, a group of priests who had previously served as the high priests in the Jerusalem temple. So there's a very strong priestly orientation in the makeup of the sect. And so the fact that they would have a priestly Messiah is really not surprising.
We have a super chat question, but it's not included in the super chat. Arthur Palumbo, thank you for your question. He has it here. Just bear in mind, everybody, please try to include your question in the super chat, because sometimes I might not notice that it's outside of it and I might miss it. So anyway, our first question is where is the evidence found that Jesus conformed to the purity laws?
Well, yeah. So actually, if you look, so let me just qualify and say again, I am not a New Testament or gospel expert, so I can't cite off the top of my head chapter and verse, but I am roughly familiar with, with the content. So, for example, if you look at the passages where Jesus reportedly is debating with his opponents, who are presented usually as Pharisees or the Pharisees and the scribes, whoever the scribes were, there's a famous passage, for example, where the Pharisees criticize Jesus and his disciples for not washing their hands before they eat a meal, right? Before they eat. I'm sure you're familiar with that, right? And if you take a look at that passage, and if I had it in front of me, I would quote it right now. I would be able to read it to you. But if you take a look at that passage, what they say is something like, why do you and your disciples not follow the traditions of the fathers and wash your hands before you eat? And Jesus's response is to call them hypocrites who worship God with their lips. He actually cites a passage from Isaiah, right? Who worship God with their lips, but do not actually observe, the law properly. He says something like, you adhere to man-made traditions instead of divine law. That's a paraphrase. And it's very interesting because what is the traditions of the fathers? The traditions of the fathers that he's referring to is Pharisaic oral law. What is that? So this has to do with the approach to the interpretation of law. As I said, all Jews took for granted, I mean, it wasn't even like a question, that you observe the laws in the 5 books of Moses. And again, this is true of both Jesus and Paul. Everybody's observing the laws, I mean, to whatever degree, but they're, you take for granted, those are the laws, you observe them. It's divine law. The laws in the 5 books of Moses, it's the laws that God is believed to have given to his people, right, through Moses, right? So it's divine law, it's written down. So that's the written law. Now, as you I'm sure you're aware, laws can be interpreted differently, right? How do you properly observe the law? And the divisions between the different Jewish groups in this period, including Jesus and his movement, focused on not whether or not you should observe the law, but how to properly observe the law. What when God said he wants his people to do something, what did he mean? How do you interpret that, and how do you properly observe it? And so there were different approaches that evolved among different Jewish groups in this period as to, how to interpret and properly observe the law. The Sadducees, who were the Jerusalem elite in this period, and who, by the way, ultimately were related also to dispossessed Sadducite priests, were literalists in their interpretation of the written law. They believed that that you could not take what was written in divine law and interpret it aside from the way it was literally written. In other words, they were literalists when it came to the interpretation of written law. I like to, they say you couldn't embellish on it. It wasn't flexible. It's in the letter of the law. This, by the way, is why the Sadducees reportedly didn't believe in resurrection of the dead, because there's no explicit doctrine of resurrection of the dead in the 5 books of Moses. So they rejected that doctrine. The Pharisees believed in it, but the Sadducees did not. I like to say that the late Chief Justice Antonin Scalia was a Sadducee in his approach to the interpretation of the law. A literalist, right? It's literally there. The Pharisees, who again are often portrayed as Jesus's opponents in the gospel accounts, had a different approach. They believed that you could take what was written in the letter of the law and interpret it differently in different ways. This is how they get to the doctrine of resurrection, which is, again, not in the 5 books of Moses. And this debate that Jesus reportedly has with the Pharisees about washing your hands is very instructive, because nowhere in the 5 books of Moses is there a law that says that you have to wash your hands before you eat. It's not in there. And that is Jesus's response. His response isn't that you reject the written law. His response is that you guys are doing it incorrectly because you are imposing human traditions, human interpretation on divine law. And he calls them hypocrites who are worshiping with their lips, right, but not with their hearts. And so you can actually go through the gospel accounts over and over again and see different instances of this. So it's important for me again to emphasize that to understand Jesus, you have to understand the Jewish context that he's in, and sort of rip away the centuries, of overlay that have developed since then. Thank you for that question.
How long were these purity laws practiced? When did it start and when did it end?
Yeah. Wow, that's a really great question. And actually, there's a book that was published within the last year or two by an Israeli scholar named Yonatan Adler, which kind of deals with this question with regard, especially to the beginning of it. And here's the problem. The problem is, and this is actually one of the things that he grapples with in his book, in terms of when Jews started to observe these laws. So there are several problems here. When were the 5 books of Moses actually composed, edited, written down, at least in some form similar to what we have today? And that's a question that scholars completely disagree about, right? There's no consensus about when the 5 books of Moses took a form where, that would be recognizable to us today. Certainly that happened before the time of Qumran, because we have copies of the 5 books of Moses among the Dead Sea Scrolls, but how much farther back in time can you go, right? So first of all, the question is when did people start to observe these laws? Well, it's connected with the question of when did the laws actually develop into some form where they begin to be widely, or if not universally, observed, right, by the Jewish population. So there's that question, right? Probably many scholars might say around the time of Ezra, Nehemiah, the Persian period, maybe a little later than that. By then, somewhere, Babylonian period. And so we're talking basically 6th, 5th, 4th centuries BC, something like that. But there's kind of an evolution over the course of time, right? One of the things that Jonathan Adler deals with in his book is so when do we actually begin to get not just like, the 5 books of Moses, but also archaeological evidence. We talked about Jewish ritual baths, mikvaot. There's another indicator of the observance of Jewish ritual purity in the late Second Temple period, the time of Jesus, and that is stone vessels, mugs and plates and all sorts of things made out of stone, carved stone, because according to the way Jews came to understand biblical law, stone cannot become impure by touching something that's impure. Pottery, by the way, can. So if a lizard crawls across your dish, the dish is impure and you have to throw it away. You have to break it. You can't use it. But stone can't become impure through contact with something that's pure. So in the late Second Temple period, we begin to find in archaeological sites in Israel lots of stone vessels, and that suggests a widespread observance of purity laws in addition to the mikvaot, the Jewish ritual baths. Now, here's the problem. The problem is that Jewish ritual baths, mikvaot, and stone vessels don't really begin to appear before around 100 BC. I mean, it's really a phenomenon of the late Second Temple period, 1st century BC, 1st century AD. So does this mean that before that, people weren't observing purity laws, or exactly what's going on? Some scholars have suggested maybe people were, but they didn't have mikvaot, so they're just using natural bodies of water to immerse in. Certainly, the fact that these ritual baths and stone vessels become common suggests that a concern with the observance of ritual purity became more common among a majority of the Jewish population. But does the absence of these before that, does that mean that people simply weren't observing purity laws? I personally don't believe that. Purity laws in different forms were common all throughout the ancient world, not just among Jews. So I don't believe that purity laws were not being observed before that, but exactly when, trying to pin it down, very hard to do. And then the same thing kind of happens afterwards. So after 70, after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70, the number of ritual baths and stone vessels begins to go down, drop, until we get to like, by the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, they've basically disappeared altogether. Does that mean Jews stopped observing Jewish ritual purity laws? No, that's absolutely not the case. We know that Jews continue to observe purity laws. I mean, there are still purity laws that are being observed today. So the absence of these features in the archaeological record at a certain point doesn't mean that Jews stopped observing purity laws. What does happen, however, after 70 is that many of the laws relating to purity observance become irrelevant because they are connected with the Jerusalem temple. And once the temple is destroyed, the need to observe the laws connected with the temple, those become obsolete. And so there is still Jewish purity laws being observed today, but on a much more limited basis than let's say, 2,000 years ago.
Can you tell us a bit about what was it like for someone to join the sect? How difficult was it for someone to join the sect and get involved with these laws and really the laws in general?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, admission to the sect, first of all, was only open to a very small proportion of the overall population. And if you were allowed to apply for admission, you did undergo this kind of rigorous 2 to 3 year long period of initiation. You're admitted. If you're admitted in stages. There's testing along the way where they actually tested you. There was an overseer who kind of tested, various initiates. You were gradually admitted in stages so that at a certain point, like after a year, you might be allowed to participate in the communal meals and eat the pure food of the sect. And then after another year had passed, you would be allowed to consume also the pure drink of the sect. And at a certain point of initiation, if you reached a certain stage, you also had to surrender your personal possessions to the sect, because this sect practiced the pooling of possessions. So you gave up your personal property to the sect. So it's a really difficult lifestyle. I mean, it was very restrictive. I recommend to your audience, if you have a chance, to go and read the Community Rule. By the way, all of the Dead Sea Scrolls pretty much are accessible online through Google. One of the more interesting sectarian scrolls is called the Community Rule. When it was first discovered, it used to be called the Manual of Discipline. Some scholars, at least in the past, described it as kind of the constitution of the Qumran sect. And it contains, among other things, something that's called a penal code, or referred to as a penal code, with a series of punishments for people who violate rules when there is a meeting of the community. When they get together and they have like a meeting, there's all sorts of things that you're not allowed to do. And there are very harsh punishments for violating those rules. For example, you're not allowed to spit into the meeting. You're not allowed to laugh foolishly. There's all sorts of things. You can't interrupt somebody. And the punishments for transgression are really harsh. I mean, there are things like, reduction of the amount of food or drink, or exclusion from the food and drink. And if all you can do is consume the pure food and drink, then you're kind of stuck. All the way up to, depending on the infraction, all the way up to actually being banished from the sect. So it was a really hard lifestyle, and that kind of raises the question: why would anybody even want to join? Not very attractive, and really the reason is because these folks claimed that they were the ones who were going to be admitted to God's kingdom on earth at the end of days, and if you buy into that, then you're going to be willing to sacrifice, whatever it is now to make sure that happens. So that apparently is what would have attracted followers, but it's also important to remember that this was a small group. In other words, not just the Qumran sect, but the overall movement was a very small number of people relative to the overall population. They're small, they're marginal. They've been blown now kind of out of all proportion because of the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? I mean, this fantastic collection of literature that we have from Qumran is really kind of, put them into a much more prominent position than they would have occupied originally in society at that time.
Do we know when the Qumran sect began?
We don't know exactly when the Qumran sect began. And this is, again, one of these questions where if you ask scholars, you'll get a whole range of different theories or different opinions. I like to think that my views represent kind of a mainstream, if not a majority view. So my view on this, and this is, I don't have a strong dog in this fight, but my view on this is that the likely scenario is the first half of the 2nd century BC, meaning somewhere between about 200 and 150 BC. And the reason is because it was in this period that the Zadokites, who had served reportedly since the time of Solomon as the high priests in the Jerusalem temple, lost control of the high priesthood through a series of really complicated events and became dispossessed. And this family, this very extended family of Zadokite priests, apparently branched off in different directions. And one branch apparently was instrumental in founding, and at least initially leading, this sect, members of whom later settled at Qumran. So Qumran actually is not established at that point. It's the archaeological evidence that we have from Qumran indicates that it's not established until later. I think the settlement at Qumran is established somewhere around the year 80 BC, but for sure somewhere between about 100 and 50 BC. So you have the initial formation of the sect, and then at some point, a number of decades later, the establishment of the settlement at Qumran.
We have a super chat question, although this does look like it's off topic. Vesper, thank you for your super chat. Any relation with Nazarene Mandeans and Essenes?
No. I have to say, not that I've ever heard. So I'm just going to give it a simple no. Sorry to be so short, but yeah, nothing I can actually say about that.
Do we know if the sect was violent? Because some claim that the Qumran sect may be affiliated with zealots. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I don't think that, no, the Zealots are another group that we know of from this period. We have, historical references to different, mostly in Josephus, but not only, to different Jewish groups in this period. And the Zealots are one of them. But I don't think that there's any connection between that, and I don't know of any connection between the Essenes and the Zealots. Now, were they violent is a very interesting question, because our outside sources, primarily in this case Philo, actually describe them as peaceful, peace-loving. And so, generally speaking, people have taken that seriously. But then you look at some of the sectarian literature from Qumran, particularly the War Scroll, which is the scroll that describes this 40-year-long war between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness at the end of days. And it's very violent. There's a lot of killing and blood and stuff like that going on. So, so were they peace-loving or were they violent? And I actually don't think that those two things are mutually exclusive. I mean, they could have been overall a peaceful people, but then anticipated this kind of turmoil and, bloody scenario at the end of days. So, that's what we know about, again, kind of a complicated picture. I will also say, by the way, that remember that not all scholars agree that the community that lived at Qumran, the Qumran sect associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, are the Essenes mentioned in our sources like Josephus, Philo, and Pliny. And one of the reasons for that is because of the seemingly internal contradictions between the two different sources of information. And this is an example of one of those, right? Were they peace-loving or were they violent? And you get different pictures depending on the sources. But I actually, again, don't see that information as being mutually exclusive or necessarily contradictory.
What did they expect when judgment came?
Well, again, you can go online and read the War Scroll, which is really interesting, which is basically that the forces of evil or the sons of darkness are going to be obliterated. They literally, the War Scroll is like a blueprint for this big war at the end of days. And it describes actual battles and battle formations, military equipment. It's really a remarkable piece of literature. They're going to be accompanied, the Sons of Light, that's them, are going to be accompanied into battle side by side with God's angels, right? God's angels are fighting on their side. But the forces of darkness on the other side also have evil angels fighting with them. There's this figure called Belial, who's like a devil kind of a figure, a bad angel. And so it's like you've got the human and the divine side by side, and some really weird stuff going on. On the one hand, in a lot of cases, the battle formations are really consistent. They're drawing on what they knew about military warfare in that period. So their military formations are in many ways consistent with military formations in the Roman world in that period. The same thing with a lot of the military equipment. But then you get some really weird stuff, like for example, a lot of their military equipment is going to have, going to be made of gold and have precious gems in it. And they're all going to be carrying banners with all these slogans like, the beloved of God, or I don't know, all sorts of different slogans. The people who are going to lead them into battle are the priests, and they're going to be wearing, the high priests are going to be wearing their priestly vestments. They're going to be wearing their linen with the scarlet thread, and very strange, and also really strange. The people who are going to lead them into battle, the priests and like the officers and all of that, they're elderly. They're like men who are like 40, 50, even up to 60 years old. It's going to be an army of the elderly in many ways. So there's all sorts of these kind of weird, what we would consider to be, it wasn't to them, but, kind of imaginary elements side by side with actual real descriptions of military equipment, military formations, and the kinds of fighting that you would have in an actual battle at that time.
When does the War Scroll date?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm going, oh, yeah, because the date of the War Scroll is one of the things that's debated by scholars. And the reason it's debated by scholars is because the dating of it, the composition, not the actual copies that we have, right? So just to clarify, you know, when you originally write a book, right, author a book, that's the composition. So you might like write it in 1980, but then it's reprinted later on. In their case, it would have been copied later on. So the question is, when was the War Scroll originally composed, right? And the copies of the War Scroll that we have from Qumran might not necessarily be the original copies, right? So when was it originally composed? And the date of composition depends on which scholar you believe. Again, I don't actually have strong feelings about this many dogs in this particular fight. The dating has really, the question of the dating is really hinged on the kind of warfare and military equipment that we see. It was actually Yigal Yadin who originally published the War Scroll. That was his, let me get this right, that was his PhD dissertation, was on, it was the scroll of the War of the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. And so he was the one who originally published that. He was, of course, an expert on ancient warfare as well as modern warfare. He was chief of staff of the Israeli army at some point during his life. And he compared the equipment and the formations that are described in the War Scroll to Roman warfare and formations. But since then, other scholars have claimed that, in fact, there are more similarities to Greek styles of warfare, by which I mean Hellenistic Greek, you know, after the time of Alexander the Great. And so this kind of gives you a range of, you know, where should you put the War Scroll? Probably 2nd century somewhere, maybe not unreasonable, but again, it's going to depend on, you know, where you think the similarities between, the greatest similarities are between the, you know, the kinds of military equipment and the formations that are described in it, right?
And just to be clear, you meant 2nd century BC, right?
Did I say BC? Did I not say BC? I meant BC. Yeah. I hope I didn't say AD, but anyway, it was BC.
No,
yeah.
You didn't say AD
I
or
just said it,
beyond.
right?
I was
okay.
just making
Yeah.
sure. Okay. No problem. Cal Ravine, I hope I pronounced your name right. Thank you for your super chat. Do you think Jesus had heard of the Qumranian teaching of righteousness before purity?
Oh, interesting. That's an interesting question. Thank you. You know, I'm glad you didn't ask if I think that Jesus is the teacher of righteousness, because I don't think so. The scrolls that refer to the teacher of righteousness were composed before the time of Jesus. But could Jesus have heard of the teacher of righteousness? That's an interesting question. Possible. I don't think there's any way of knowing that. I do think that that, you know, direct influence between Jesus and his movement and the Qumran sect was very limited. If at all. And again, you know, John the Baptist may have been a point of contact, but, you know, again, if we take the gospel account seriously, Jesus spent most of his life in his ministry up north in Galilee, and, you know, Qumran is down south, quite a distance away. I mean, I guess the answer to my answer to your question would be, I don't think we can rule it out. It's possible, but I also think that it would be virtually impossible to prove. Yeah, and to my mind, maybe a little unlikely, but not necessarily impossible.
And in my closing questions, can you tell us about, like, when did the composition of the Dead Sea Scrolls start, and when did it come to an end?
Well, the majority of right. So let me clarify again the question of composition versus copying, right? So we have among the Dead Sea Scrolls works that are not sectarian, that certainly were composed centuries, originally authored, right? Originally written centuries before the time of Qumran. Because, for example, we have copies of the 5 books of Moses among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and certainly those were written originally centuries before the time of Qumran, right? And so it is with some of the other works that we have at Qumran. The question, though, is the actual Dead Sea Scrolls, the actual copies of the works that we have, right? When were those written, right? And so the majority of the scrolls at Qumran date to the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. There are some scrolls that date a little earlier, so that go back to like the 3rd century, some that go into the 1st century. But again, the majority are 2nd and 1st centuries BC.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Jodi Magness.
Thank you for having me back, Jacob.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.